Hello, today we're going to start our discussion of the section in Pargament's book on religion and coping. In chapter 4 of Pargament, we have the opportunity to learn about some of the past psychological perspectives on coping that are characterized as deterministic. These approaches to understanding coping all have in common the feature of viewing the person as being acted upon by either internal factors going on within the individual, either psychologically or physiologically, or external factors going on in the environment, all of which contribute to stressful situations in a person's life towards which they react, but in a way that is not necessarily intentional. And these approaches also have in common the idea that the person is not really all that mindful or aware of how stressors are affecting them or how they are reacting or dealing with them. Starting with Freud's idea that we have an unconscious mind and that things go on in our unconscious mind that affect our thoughts, feelings, and behavior. Because these things are unconscious, we're not aware of them. And these factors are referred to as intra, I-N-T-R-A, psychic, P-S-Y-C-H-I-C. As you know, Freud has this idea that our mind is made up of id, ego, and superego, and that much of the structure of our mind is unconscious. The ego, part of our personality, serves as a mediator between the id and the superego, but sometimes the tensions between the id and the superego become so great that the ego is not able to resolve the conflict. When that occurs, then the person experiences anxiety according to Freud and tries to deal with that anxiety by engaging in defense mechanisms. As you are probably aware, defense mechanisms are unconsciously originated, self-defeating patterns of behavior in which we might engage in an effort to deal with this conflict that the ego cannot resolve between the id and the superego. An interesting example of a defense mechanism is what's called projection, P-R-O-J-E-C-T-I-O-N, in which the person projects onto another person unacceptable feelings the individual is having within themselves but can't really acknowledge. If I were experiencing projection, I might see you as being angry towards me, when in fact I am the one who is experiencing the anger. So Freud's theory is an example of what is called psychic, P-S-Y-C-H-I-C, psychic determinism. So Freud's approach is looking at what's going on in our unconscious mind. Another interesting notion about stress and how it affects us is Hans Selye, S-E-L-Y-E, Hans Selye's general adaptation model of stress. It's interesting how Hans Selye accidentally discovered his model of stress. He set out to study the physiology of rats, and he was doing a study where he was injecting rats with hormone tissue. Um, Actually, it was ovary tissue. He was injecting it into the rats to see what effect the hormone that was in that tissue would have on the rat's health. And much to his surprise, many of his rats got sick and died. So he then injected them with other substances but got the same results. Many of his rats got sick and died. He was having trouble figuring out an explanation for what was happening to his rats. But then it occurred to him that maybe the stress of going through the experimental procedure itself was causing the rat's reaction. So he injected the rats with saline, which is a pretty harmless material, and still got the same results. So this increased his level of confidence about his idea that the rats were reacting to the stress of the procedure. And based on his experience, he came up with the idea that the rats had what he called a non-specific response to stress, meaning no matter what the source of the stress was, the rats were reacting in the same way. We can think of this in ourselves, this principle. Think about times when you get stressed out. Each of us has our own unique ways of reacting to stress. When we think about different organ systems of our body, different people react to stress in characteristically different ways. Some people might get headaches. Some people might get stomach aches. Some people might have gastrointestinal symptoms. Some people might have their skin break out, etc. So, in other words, each of us has a non-specific reaction to stress. It doesn't matter what the source of the stress is. When we're stressed out, we each tend to react in a similar kind of way. So Saley came up with what he called his general adaptation syndrome. And in it, he describes 3 stages of physiological means physical, response to stress. The alarm reaction is the first stage. The second stage is the stage of resistance. And the last stage is the stage of exhaustion. In the alarm stage, Saley explained how we experience a kind of a fight or flight response. You're probably familiar with this notion from taking general psychology or perhaps other courses you've taken. When we are in a state of danger, our autonomic nervous system becomes aroused to prepare us to either fight or flee. Then Saley explained how our body will move into the resistance stage where it draws upon its resources to combat the stress, whatever it happens to be. Hopefully that's sufficient to get us through a stressful time. But if the stress is more chronic and we're not dealing with it as effectively as we might, we then could enter into the exhaustion stage. And the exhaustion stage can be characterized by damage to tissue in any organ system in the body, and also a weakening of our body's immune system. Let's take, for example, somebody who is working in a job they really need to pay their bills, and they have a boss who is not easy to get along with. The boss is critical. The boss yells at the person a lot. No matter what they do, it's never good enough. And after a while, the person finds himself having stomach aches. and passing blood. And they go to the doctor and they find out they have an ulcer. What's happened there is that there's tissue damage to an organ system in the person's body, their gastrointestinal system, as a result, most likely, of all the stress that they're dealing with. Now, Saley's approach is similar to Freud's in that he's saying, just like Freud, these things are happening to us. We're reacting to them. We don't really understand what's going on. It's sort of like we're in a helpless position. With Freud, it was the mind, and with Saley, it's the body. But both of these approaches to understanding stress are what we would call deterministic. Another interesting historical development has to do with a gradual coming to understand post-traumatic stress disorder. In World War I, it was referred to as shell shock, I believe. And it wasn't until more recent times when people began to understand that post-traumatic stress disorder occurring in war veterans. Of course, there are many other traumatic situations people may go through that result in them experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. But again, the historical way of looking at PTSD is something that happens to the person. They don't really understand what's going on. It's more of a deterministic view of how a person might react to severe stress in the form of some sort of life-threatening trauma, whether it's war, a car accident, being assaulted, and other types of situations that might result in a traumatic event and then the following symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Another interesting study that was done historically, again, a number of years ago, was following the occurrence of the Coconut Grove nightclub fire in Boston in 1942. This fire killed 492 people. Think about that, 492 people. A fire started in the nightclub. Some of the doors had been chained. People couldn't get out. There was a narrow stairway going down to the street level, and people were piling into the stairway. They were falling, piling on top of each other. It was an awful situation. So a researcher named Lindemann studied the grief reactions of the relatives of those who died in the fire. And he also studied people in the armed forces and people in hospitals who were in life-threatening situations. And based on his research, he identified what he called a, quote, remarkable, quote, uniform syndrome of acute grief that he helped us to better understand. Again, when we look at stress and how we deal with it from this psychological perspective having to do with post-traumatic stress disorder, for the longest time we would have to say it was viewed in a more deterministic way as well. And again, the idea here is that stuff happens, we're not really aware of or have a good understanding of what's going on and how we're reacting to it, and the outcomes tend to be negative because they are determined by the stressful event itself and our reaction. So we're not really responding in an intentional kind of way, we're more reacting to it. This is the idea. of looking at stress from a deterministic point of view. And then finally, there's a more of a social perspective on stress, again from a deterministic way of looking at it. And this comes in part from the work of the famous sociologist Emil Durkheim, who looked at the relationship between the level of decay, turmoil in society, and suicide. And he found in Europe, this is the early 20th century, that the more chaotic conditions were in societies, the more people felt disconnected socially, and this lack of social integration he associated with suicide. Another line of research that also looked at social factors associated with stress from a deterministic point of view again is the work of Holmes, Holmes, and Ray, Rhae, who looked at the relationship between social factors and the way of life changes and stressors in a person's life. So Ray's name is actually spelled R-A-H-E. And what he found, what they found, was that significant life changes were associated with an increase in stress in people's lives. And the more significant life changes they experienced in a defined period of time, say over 6 months or a year, the greater their likelihood of having health problems. They came up with a list of different types of life changes that were stressful, and they rank ordered them. At the top of the list would be things like the death of a spouse. And lower in the list could even be positive life events like getting married, which for most of us it's a very joyful time, but it also involves change. And the idea here is that change brings on some stress in our lives. So this earlier research helped us to appreciate the effects of stress on different aspects of our lives, but it did not focus that much on coping, which of course is the main focus of Pargament's text and a big part of our course. And the difference between coping and a deterministic perspective on stress is that when we look at stress from a deterministic point of view, we're saying that we are just reacting. We're not choosing how we're handling it, we're just reacting. And it can be our minds, bodies, our behavior, but we're just reacting. But when we move into the realm of coping, Pargament helps us to appreciate that when we are coping, there's some choice involved in how we are understanding and dealing with stressful situations in our lives. And eventually we're going to look at how religion comes into play in that coping process. In the psychological literature, we can also look at work done on what's called resilience, R-E-S-I-L-I-E-N-C-E. And resilience is our ability to bounce back after going through some sort of adversity. There's a lot of work that's been done in that particular field. And we can also look at work on what's called post-traumatic growth. And this has to do with how some people are able to not only bounce back in the case of resilience, but even grow as a result of stressful experiences they have gone through. Think about your own life and struggles that you've had. We all have them. And how you were affected, how you dealt with it. If you were able to bounce back, if you were able to grow through those experiences, then you have some sense of what we're talking about with resilience and post-traumatic growth. So this line of research, looking at things like resilience and post-traumatic growth, points to the observation that we are engaged in a transaction with the environment around us when dealing with stress. So transaction, T-R-A-N-S-A-C-T-I-O-N, transaction. The idea here is that we are interacting with the environment and the environment is interacting with us. So there's this two-way process going on. And Hardiman is helping us appreciate how coping involves this two-way transaction between the person and the environment. The environment affects us, we affect the environment when we're going through stressful times. So as we move into this area of looking at coping from a transactional point of view, we might consider the question, well, what distinguishes coping from defense mechanisms? Think about that for a moment. What distinguishes coping from defense mechanisms? Well, as we're saying, coping involves transactions between people and their environments. Coping is also multidimensional, meaning it involves thoughts, feelings, and behavior, and it's multi-layered, meaning that it involves different layers of social relationships. Coping rejects the notion of psychic determinism, which is characteristic of Freud's theory about defense mechanisms. And the assumption here is that the response to crisis is not fully determined. The response to crisis is not fully determined, but rather it is at least partially chosen. And this notion that the response to crisis is not fully determined, but rather that it is at least partially chosen, sets coping apart from defense mechanisms. We are suggesting then that coping is transactional. It involves a matter of choice, and that it involves the interaction of the person and the environment, making it transactional. Coping is also multidimensional, meaning that it affects our thoughts, feelings, behavior, and relationships. And through coping, we are actually able to make changes in these same dimensions of thoughts, feelings, behavior, and relationships. And coping is also multi-layered. And what this means is that we do not cope in a vacuum. Each of us is involved in layers of social relationships, and we carry these systems along in our coping. Sometimes these systems may assist us in coping, and sometimes they may create obstacles for us. But social relationships are completely intertwined in our coping. Here's an example. Two different hypothetical situations here. A woman is in an abusive relationship with her husband. The abuse has been going on for some time, and she's tried to stay in the marriage and work it out, but it just keeps getting worse. The abuse is escalating, and the woman fears for her safety and the safety of her children. In situation one, the woman goes to her family and tells them what's going on and asks for help. And the reaction of her family basically is, you made this bed, so go lie in it. We told you he wasn't good for you, but you married him anyway, and you have to work it out on your own. In situation two, the woman goes to her family and tells them what's going on, and they say, how can we help you? We want to do whatever we can to help you to be safe and to stay safe. We are here for you to help any way we can. So here we see two very different social contexts in which this abuse is taking place, where the family system, the extended family system, in one situation is one that is turning its back on the woman in the abusive relationship, whereas in the other system, the family is trying to be supportive and helpful any way they can. So we can see in these two examples this idea about how coping is multi-layered, and how social relationships are completely intertwined in coping. And one final point I would like to make in this discussion is that coping, which is transactional, non-deterministic, involves possibilities and choices. And I would like to share with you a quote from your book on page 87 by Irvin Yalom. This quote helps us to appreciate that possibilities and choices are hallmarks of coping. We cannot not choose. Even when we do nothing, that is a choice. Here's what Yalom has to say. All of us face natural adversities that influence our lives, but that does not mean that we have no responsibility or choice in the situation. We are responsible for what we make of our handicaps, for our attitudes toward them, for the bitterness, anger, or depression that act synergistically with the original coefficient of adversity to ensure that a handicap will defeat the individual. When all else fails, when the coefficient of adversity is formidable, still one is responsible for the attitude one adopts towards the adversity, whether to live a life of bitter regret or to find a way to transcend the handicap and to fashion a meaningful life despite it. Argument provides fascinating examples of differences in how people in similar circumstances cope with those circumstances, where some people are able to adapt very well and others are not. He also shares with us the ideas of a writer named Anthony, who talks about different ways in which children may react to adversity. And Anthony uses the analogy between children and three dolls made of different materials, helping us to understand how children can vary greatly in how they are affected by and deal with adversity in their lives. He says this about dolls. When hit with a hammer, a doll made of glass shatters. A doll made of plastic becomes permanently dented. A doll made of steel gives off a fine metallic ping. You'll find this in argument page 88. He also gives us examples of adolescents on burn units and how one adolescent is coping remarkably well with being badly burned, while another one is pretty much giving up. In these examples, the adolescents actually were paralyzed, and it was adults who were the burn patients. So he says, one of the adolescents drops out of college, lives unhappily at home, dependent on his family, criticizes those who try to help him, and overdoses on medication. The other completes college, lives independently, takes a job teaching history, and coaches a basketball team from his wheelchair. And in the case of adults who were burn patients, one patient is crying, moaning, complaining, demanding that more be done for him. Another appears completely comfortable and unconcerned. Another appears intensely preoccupied and seems to make very little contact with the observer. Still another appears sad and troubled but friendly, responding with a weak smile to any approach made to him. And so it goes from one bed to the next. So here we're seeing significant differences in how people deal with real tragedy in their lives, underscoring the idea of the transactional nature of coping. Now, coping, like religion, is also a search for significance, but it's the search for a significance of a different kind, as we will see in our next video. Coping involves the search for significance in times of stress. Thank you.